Ever wondered how your camera produces well-lit images every time you take a photo? When you squeeze the shutter release button, you actually trigger two actions: autofocusing and exposure metering. Looking at exposure metering for a moment, the camera uses its light meter to calculate the amount of light needed to create a balanced exposure. So how exactly does the camera control the correct amount of light needed? Simply with the combination of two devices, the aperture and the shutter. The aperture, which controls how much light is let in, and the shutter, which controls how long light is let in for. For example, in dark conditions, where we need more light, the camera will either keep the shutter open for a longer period of time, or set a larger aperture to increase the amount of light entering through the lens. Both actions let more light in. In brighter conditions, where we need less light, the camera will do the opposite. It will keep the shutter open for a shorter period of time, or set a smaller aperture to decrease the amount of light entering through the lens. Both actions will allow less light in. So what makes a good exposure? Simply, a good exposure is one that is not too light or too dark. Let's look at these photos of the same subject. The middle image is taken with a perfect or normal exposure. The top image is darker and underexposed. And the bottom image is lighter, so it is overexposed. So why is exposure such a big deal? Exposure is not just about how bright the image appears. Good exposure gives great details. Let's take a closer look. Take this underexposed image, for example. While the details in the bright areas are visible, they are lost in the darker areas. While in this overexposed image, the details are burnt out and lost in the brighter areas and retained in the dark areas. However, in this correctly exposed image, the details are visible throughout both shadow and highlight areas. So if getting the right exposure is so important, how do we do it? The DSLR is equipped with a great range of exposure modes to suit all users. For beginners, it's easiest to start with the fully auto and program modes. Fully auto decides all the settings for you, including flash. Program mode takes care of shutter and aperture, but leaves you to decide when to use the flash and set ISO sensitivity. Here are a few examples of the preset modes: Sports, Macro, Portrait, Landscape, and Sunset. Let's have a closer look at each. Freezing fast-moving subjects is easy using the Sports mode. In order to achieve this, the camera needs to use high shutter speeds. Once you set the camera in Sports Action mode, it will choose the highest shutter speed possible to help you freeze the image. Macro photos like this are made compelling because of their defocused or blurred background. This is technically achieved by using a large aperture. Now, by using the macro mode, the camera will use the widest aperture to blur the background as you zoom in. Great portraits have a blurred background and reproduce skin tones well. Technically, the blurred background is achieved by using a large aperture, and the skin tone is achieved by choosing a neutral color balance. When you choose the portrait mode, the camera is set up to use the largest aperture possible and a neutral white balance setting. Successful landscapes have clarity throughout the image. This clarity is achieved by using a small aperture setting. When you use the landscape mode, the camera will choose the smallest aperture possible to help you achieve clarity through the whole image. Sunset is probably the most beautiful time of the day. It's full of rich, warm hues and colors. When in sunset mode, the camera will change the color balance of the image to a slightly more orange hue to intensify the colors of the sunset or sunrise. Let's have a quick recap of what we've learnt in this tutorial. What is exposure? How does the camera control light? What is the perfect exposure? Choosing an exposure mode, and understanding exposure presets. Now that you're familiar with basic exposure, make sure you check out the other tutorials in the series and see how else you can take creative control of your camera.